Hi guys, I'm Kate Moseder, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about triggers. So what are triggers, what they look like, and more importantly, what we can do about them. And this is kind of in conjunction with my other videos. So I have one is, do you have childhood trauma? And if so, how much? And then how to deal with trauma. So these two videos, if you haven't watched them, I would definitely go ahead and subscribe to this channel, like this video, and then go back and watch those because they really will help you kind of lead into triggers. And so what is a trigger? So a trigger is a reminder of a past trauma, and these traumas range and they're subjective to the individual. So this is coming from my own experience of someone who had a lot of triggers and then didn't even know what triggers were until I was in my 20s, finally figuring out, oh, that's what's wrong with me. I'm just reliving my trauma over and over again. So I like to categorize triggers in two ways. The first way I like to categorize it is predictable and unpredictable triggers. So most of our triggers are unpredictable. That would be like you're walking in a mall and you smell cologne, and that cologne reminds you of maybe your attacker, or it reminds you of your dad who used to abuse you, like something like that. Like you didn't know that you were going to smell that scent in the mall. You didn't, walk into that. It kind of pops up. And I feel like that's how most triggers are. We're just not expecting them. And then a predictable one, the most common one would be veterans on the 4th of July, something like that. Like they already know what's coming. They know fireworks are getting ready to come, and there's really nothing they can do about it. So I like to categorize it in those two ways, and then also break it down into the 5 senses, because triggers, if you are someone that deals with triggers, or you think you might possibly have experience with triggers, you know that it really does affect the senses. So I like to start with touch, which is also physical. And I'm going to use examples for all of these. I have a couple written down here. So if this sounds like you, then keep listening. So a physical trigger could be someone who doesn't like to be hugged. So they get hugged, and whether it, the sensation is claustrophobic, or it reminds them, of a time when they didn't want to be hugged and they were hugged. So that would be an example of a physical trigger. The taste. So this one, it could be like, maybe someone passed away at Thanksgiving and you keep, the tasting that specific food makes you, remember that event. Then we have smell. So smell is kind of like that unpredictable example I gave you earlier, when you're in the mall and you're just walking and you smell that cologne, and it reminds you exactly of that one time that you were at a party, and, you get what I'm trying to say here. So I wrote down screams, bangs, whispers, because, I'm going to use the example of a war veteran again, because something like a harsh scream, like, whoa, whoa, you know what I mean? Like that kind of reaction, it just kind of sends their body into that high alert. And then the last one is see. And I put down TV shows because I really like to use the example of watching something that relates to you. So I always like to use the example of Law and Order SVU, because we know those are like sexually heinous crimes. So a lot of like survivors will binge watch something like that. And it's a trigger. Like the whole time they're watching it, they're just reliving a traumatic event. So that's kind of how we can understand triggers more in depth, and for yourself, which ones do you experience the most? For me personally, it's a lot of physical, a lot of touch. That's something that I struggle with and had to kind of overcome. So moving on to what the triggers, what they look like in ourselves, and maybe you can recognize them in your loved one or your partner, which would be like depression, anxiety, feeling overwhelmed. So that can be a way that our triggers kind of flare up. So for example, when you're in the mall and you're smelling that cologne, maybe you all of a sudden start to get anxious. You're looking around, your body is reacting to this specific scent or event, and it's replaying that scenario. It's replaying that experience. And some more extreme behaviors would be flashbacks. So we all know that's, a common one. So for example, if you don't know what a flashback is, we have a war veteran that's sitting in his house and fireworks start going off out of nowhere. All of a sudden he's feeling panicky, and then he's sitting on the couch and he starts to have flashbacks of, gory or traumatic scenes or something like that. And again, we have to remember our body is literally reliving this experience over and over again. Disassociation, if you don't know what disassociation is, I like to use the example of mind and body. So I'm staring at you and I see that you're touching my feet, but I'm so disconnected from my body right now that I don't even feel it. So a lot of people can disassociate, people that cut or, you know, use a rubber band to inflict pain. That's something that they might do to feel themselves because they literally are disassociating their mind and their body. And then another one is panic attacks. That's becoming a little bit more common. And people are realizing that, you know, a lot of people suffer from panic attacks, which is like hyperventilating, you know, anxiety. So those are some ways that it can kind of pop up, what it might look like. When we are experiencing a trigger, we're literally, like I keep saying over and over again, we are reliving that experience. Our body is in fight or flight mode. So, you know, you might be like, well, I'm just in a mall. I'm not, you know, 20 years ago back at my house when this used to happen. You can understand that, but that body is holding that score. Okay. The body keeps the score. That body knows that when you smell that smell, it's going to relive that. So back 20 years ago, you are feeling that fight or flight. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? That feeling of high alert, being on edge. So what are some things that happen when you're on high alert? Your heart is racing. Maybe you're sweaty. You can't really coherently speak words. You might just kind of be freezing, you know, fight, flight, or freeze. And something else that happens that you probably didn't know is things like digestion. When you're in fight or flight, digestion doesn't happen. So that's like one of the systems that kind of shut down when we're in that fight or flight. And the reason I tell you this is because it's important. If you are constantly in a fight or flight mode, your body is not regulating itself. You're not living your life. Your body isn't doing what it's supposed to do because it's waiting for the next thing to happen. So, you know, the reason I made this video is because I want to have you understand and address what triggers are, but also how can we cope with them, because avoiding them is a coping mechanism, but it's definitely not going to make them go away. So if we want our body to be able to relax and, you know, check back in and to be able to recognize, okay, this is a trigger. I'm experiencing this. I understand what's happening. These are some things I can try to do to regulate my body. And when I'm talking about childhood trauma in my other videos, I talk about how it's a little bit harder for people to regulate themselves. And I use myself as an example. Like, I'm someone that it takes me longer when I'm stressed out or anxious to kind of calm myself back down, where I don't like to be scared. So if my husband scares me, where it might take, you know, Joe over here 30 seconds to a minute for his heart rate to kind of go back down and be like, oh, you got me. It takes me like 5 or 10 minutes for my body to literally relax back to that normal state that it was. And that's why I don't like that, because I know what's happening when I'm in fight or flight mode. I'm getting that high cortisol. When that happens for 20 years of your life, you can see how problems can arise in your health and mental health and things like that. So, you know, the big question here is what can we do about it? Something that I'm going to say, which might be controversial, I don't know, but it's something, you know, that I fully agree with. Someone that has, like I said, a lot of triggers and has worked through a lot of triggers. Triggers are your responsibility. Okay. They are no one else's. So, you know, what's really popular right now are like safe spaces and trigger warnings and all that is fine. For people that are working through it, but we don't just get to say that's a trigger, you know, I don't want to hear it, or that's triggering, I don't want to, you know, be exposed to that. That's just not real. You can't say, you know, you're in the mall and you smell that smell and I'm triggered, so I am never going to go to the mall again, or no one should be able to have that smell because it's triggering. Like, do you kind of see how silly that sounds? Just knowing that our triggers are our responsibility to work through. But something a little bit more intimate, like your partner. So this is something that you can kind of avoid triggers to work around. Like, if I don't like to be hugged, that probably is a problem for my husband, right? So that's a trigger that I want to work through because I want to be able to show my husband affection. However, that's a trigger that my husband can provide me safe space, or he can provide me more space in general to kind of work through that trigger. Like, what can I do to, help you work through this trigger. And that's with a more intimate partner. You obviously can't ask the stranger next to you to go stand across the room because you don't like the smell of their cologne. So you kind of have to understand when it is appropriate to ask other people to kind of be a part of you and your trigger work. So there's a couple things that we can do. Knowing that triggers are pretty much impossible to avoid. If you're not treating your triggers and you're avoiding them, you're constantly limiting yourself to the things that you can be around. So you're really just hurting yourself not dealing with them. And I'm going to give you some examples of how to go through them. So one example of avoiding them, I would say, is TV shows. So I'm going to go back to that Law and Order SVU example, of sexual assault victims or rape or abuse or anything like that, because this is really important. Like if that is something that you're experiencing and you might say, oh, I love that show. I bet you do, because your mind enjoys it, but your body is on high alert the entire time. So that's something that you should probably avoid, shows like that. Or closing your eyes during certain scenes that you maybe just aren't ready for. And it's okay. And understanding that we are affected by that scene. We are affected by the show. Like that's the mature and that's the responsibility that we are taking for our triggers, because, you might watch the show for a couple of hours and now all of a sudden you're just in a bad mood and you're taking it out on everyone. Well, I don't know why I'm in a bad mood. Well, I can tell you why, because you just sat there for 3 hours and re-traumatized yourself on the couch watching a show that you felt like was interesting. So that's just an example. And unfortunately, it's probably going to be relatable for a lot of women out there. So something specific that kind of the main reason I started to go to therapy in my late 20s was because of my triggers and realizing like this like really affects me. So I like to combine triggers with therapy. And if you go to a therapist for specifically triggers, that is like a great reason to go. And, with COVID and everything, there's online options for therapy and things like that. And the reason I say therapy is like going to be my number one thing is because there are so many techniques out there that can be specific to you. And most of the time it requires talking about it and leaning on someone. And I'm going to absolutely advocate for mental health professionals because that is what they are here for. So we should definitely kind of rely on them and use that support if we can. So specifically working on your triggers, I think this might be a trigger, and then kind of working through that. Another one is a grounding technique, and a grounding technique kind of brings you back to the here and the now. Okay. So if you're someone that disassociates, this is a great one as well. Having flashbacks, I'm someone that suffers with flashbacks. So this is a grounding techniques is what I use. And I'll tell you one example of one. So, one that I like to use is that the specific flashback, I picture it on a TV screen, and that's what's playing on TV, my flashback. Well, what's another show that I'm watching? I don't know. That 70s show. So I imagine myself with a remote control and I flick the channel, and then now I'm watching that 70s show. And then I flick the channel again and it's my flashback again. And then what's another show that I like to watch? I don't know, The Office. So then I'm flicking the channel again and I'm flipping through these channels and I'm actually visualizing these shows because I watch them. I know I can picture a scene, or, I keep flipping through these channels, and that's my way of kind of getting my mind, breaking up that flashback to different things. So at first that might be kind of hard, you keep going back to that one channel, right? But after a while, you start to get used to it and you're actually playing out more of that specific show, or you're adding in more, and then eventually the flashback is gone. Something more simple is counting, counting backwards, 100, 99, 98. You'll be surprised at how often you try to skip numbers or you lose your place and then you got to start over. But those are things that kind of ground you and bring you back. And it's just like a simple task. I think of grounding as a simple task that your mind can focus on that takes up all of the attention. Something else, maybe something more physical, would be holding ice. What does it feel like? It's melting in my hand. It's cold. How fast is it melting? That's an example of something that we can do that's more of a physical grounding technique. Or stretching. You could do stretching or yoga. And the reason I say this is one, because like, how good does it feel to do like a butterfly pose? That's where your feet are together, like that, the deep stretch, or, or just grabbing your arm, like feeling how that feels in your body. is a really good way to kind of bring yourself back to the here and the now and the moment. A simple task that takes all of your mind's attention. Okay, so these are some of the things that we can do when we're feeling triggered, that are healthy and really can be done in a room full of people and it not be weird. I also want to bring up that while the triggers are good, we also want to kind of focus on relaxation techniques, because remember when I said our bodies are in fight or flight, you know, so we're getting ourselves back in our mind. We also got to kind of regulate our emotions, regulate our physiology. So we want to try to take deep breaths. We know that that's like the number one thing that's helpful. Taking deep breaths. Again, this is a task that takes up all your mind space thinking about that breath, but also it does amazing things for the body. These things sound so simple and you're like, oh, maybe roll your eyes, but just because they're simple doesn't mean that they don't work. We're going back to the basics here. Your body has forgotten how to regulate itself because you have spent so many years in fight or flight or freeze. You have spent so many years just operating at high anxiety. Something like taking a deep breath is hard for you. Taking multiple deep breaths is hard for you. When we're talking about trauma work, you want to make sure that you're responding to yourself and you're responding to others in a trauma-informed way. So I spoke about this a lot in my other videos about, you know, how much trauma do you have or how to deal with trauma. You know, we say 0 to 10 is a range of reaction. So when we stub our toe, that's probably what a reaction on a scale of 0 to 10, probably a 2, right? Well, have you ever stubbed your toe and you responded to a 10 and you push something over or you kick something and the world is out to get you today? We're most likely responding to something else. That happens when our body is already high up here. Okay, you're not living your life at a 0 or calm, cool, and collective. You're just regulating at like a 10 or an 8. Okay, so that's something to understand. And triggers have a lot to do with that. So something to consider, you know, like I said, I challenge you to kind of go out into the world and see how you respond. When something happens, did that person respond appropriately? Was it a 5? And it's probably about right, a 5, or did they respond to something so minor and they responded to a 10? You know what I mean? So something to look at. And again, like this video, if you found it very helpful, share it with someone. Share it with people in your family. Share with your friends. Anyone that could benefit from learning a little bit more about triggers and what we can do to help each other and to help ourselves. And don't be a landmine.